pulling teeth, como dicen acá atrás. No, eso es un circo, un circo. Mira, ¿qué es lo que te tenía que decir? ¿Estás oyendo? ¿Aló? ¿Me estás oyendo? ¿Aló? Sí, no, es que la comunicación está un poco cortada. Oye, lo siguiente, yo ahorita estoy entrando a un panel de Francisco Morales. ¿Estás ahí? Okay. Mira, que estoy entrando ahorita a un panel de Francisco Morales.
We should start because we're going to run out of time. Okay. Good evening. I think we're going to get started because we're going to run out of time. We have a short session tonight, which we arranged at the last minute. So it's very nice to see so many of you here tonight. We had in the past several sessions organized about Venezuela here at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. This is a new one, prompted in large part by the recent developments in the country, both in terms of oil policy, what's happening with PdVSA, the national oil company, debt payments that have been missed, but the country claims not to be defaulting, all kinds of very puzzling events that call for analysis and explanations. So my name is Antoine Half. I'm responsible for the oil program, the program on global oil markets here at the center at Columbia University. Let me say, first of all, that tonight our event, like other events of this kind is being webcast live, and a full video and podcast recording will be available shortly on our website and on iTunes in the coming days. For those of you who are watching online, you can ask questions at any time using our hashtag CGEP events or and our Twitter handle at Columbia U Energy, and we'll answer your questions. So we have 3 speakers, which is not self-evident here, but I have 3 speakers tonight. The third one is arriving. To my right, immediately to my right, is Francisco Monaldi, who's well known to people who've been associated with the center because he's been a speaker at several previous events. He's a non-resident fellow of the center, and he's an economist at Rice University whose work focuses on energy and to a large extent on Latin America. I won't read his full bio. I don't think we have time for that. Next to him is Luisa Palacios, who's also a fellow at the center, based in New York with Medley Advisors, a consulting firm. So the third one is Miguel Angel Santos, who's coming from Harvard tonight. We'll touch on several of the developments and several of the dimensions of the current crisis, the current spiraling down of conditions in Venezuela. I think you can say there's 3 levels on which the recent drama is playing out. The oil level, what's going on with the oil industry, with oil production, what's the outlook for oil supply. And Venezuela is a very significant, very important supplier, much larger than its production levels would suggest, because it's a key component to the feedstock of the US Gulf Coast refining system. Replacing Venezuelan barrels, should they continue to decline, is not so easy, perhaps is impossible. So oil is one dimension, debt is another dimension, the economy is a third dimension, and of course politics pervades all these dimensions and is constantly part of the discussion, whichever way you look at recent events. So let's start with Francisco. Just a few opening remarks, and then Luisa will make some remarks. Hopefully Miguel will be here by then, and we'll open up to a more active, interactive discussions with questions and comments from the audience as well.
Thank you, Antoine. It's a pleasure to be here. Is it? I will focus my remarks on what's happening in the oil sector, and in particularly sort of the events that have transpired in the last few weeks are very dramatic. As many of you know, we have had a purge in Petróleos de Venezuela, in PdVSA, the national oil company, that started with the detention and indictment of executives throughout the company, about 50 of them, and then ended up with after the substitution of both the Minister of Oil, Eulogio del Pino, and the head of PdVSA, Nelson Martinez, they were substituted by a general from the National Guard, and a few days later they were also indicted and detained, the 2 that had led the oil sector for the past few years. That was preceded a week before by detention of all the board members of Citgo, the affiliate of Petróleos de Venezuela in the U.S. The executives, the board members were asked to come for a meeting in Venezuela, and they were detained. And so that was, by the way, a signal that something very different was happening, in the sense that before that, the explanation that most of us had was basically, they are going against all the executives that worked for Rafael Ramirez in PdVSA, and are sort of using what happening in PdVSA in terms of the production decline, and in terms of the connection to Rafael Ramirez as a scapegoat for what's happening in the Venezuelan economy. But up till a few months back, the theory was that Nelson Martinez would be heading PdVSA after Del Pino and all the people closer to Ramirez had left. But now they clearly decided to move more aggressively and remove the last sort of oil executive with significant experience and put PdVSA in charge of the armed forces. About 2 months ago, we have had a substitution also of the board of PdVSA for a lot of members that were not oil people. So the events, if you look at them in hindsight, are pretty clear where the direction was going. But of course, in the middle, you have a lot of noise and things that, Mr. Del Pino, published a Twitter video in which he said until the very last minute he was talking to the president saying, hey, it's, people are attacking me. And anyway, so how to read this? Of course, one immediate reading is that, the military, this is a government that is sustained by the armed forces. And of course, the armed forces for a long while were interested in taking control over PdVSA, and this is clearly happening now. But it's interesting that the person that has been appointed is a general from the National Guard, that his resume includes two main things: that having been the repressor of the 2014 protest, and recently working for the some of the misiones of the sort of social program, Misión Vivienda, and that puts him in a very personal connection to President Maduro, and also the fact that he's a repressor, fits into the pattern of getting the most loyalists, the people who have the most to lose, if the government falls down. And so there seems to be a personal connection to this specific general, and I wouldn't say that this is sort of the armed forces institutionally, the one they will appoint, but anyways, it's clearly a combination of the two. Of course, it continues to be true, and Reuters reported that Rafael Ramirez, the current UN ambassador from Venezuela, was removed from his position, but it hasn't become official yet. He's still, there. And the question, of course, is apparently he's been asked to go back to Caracas, and of course, from what the Prosecutor General of Venezuela is saying, it seems that he's going to be detained, even though it hasn't been official either. So this clearly removes one of the main rivals of Maduro from the presidential candidacy, which is the other big thing. So the other big political event we have, of course, is potentially a presidential election in 2018, and Maduro clearly is moving to control the re-election. And of course, as in many other revolutions and situations of this nature around the world, these purges that are supposed to be about corruption have a very big component, a political component of removing enemies, but also it's important for them from time to time, as has been said by many revolutionaries, to bring some blood, to make, to get some scapegoats for the bad things that have happened in the past and renew what is happening. And just to finish my remarks, of course, this comes in the midst of a dramatic situation for PdVSA, a collapse of production. And in particular, it accelerated in the last few months. The sanctions, financial sanctions of the US that are clearly affecting both the company and its partners and service providers. And in addition, the fact that we are in this very weird situation in which, people used to say that you are either pregnant or not, where in the case of PdVSA, it's defaulted, but not. We don't know exactly in which situation the financial, how the landscape of how we're going to proceed in terms of default, it's going to play out. And so this requires probably more than ever very capable hands in charge of the financial side of PdVSA, the operations, et cetera. And we have a neophyte, a person who does not know anything about the business, and is bringing a team of military people that do not know anything about the business, and have removed almost the top 5 levels of people who knew about oil. So the perspectives are, of course, a worsening of the decline that we had, this year and last year, for next year, unless the price of oil goes up, which of course Venezuela can help a little bit, but goes up to a level in which they, are able to start paying back a lot of their and maybe contain the debacle, but it's very unlikely.
So as often with Venezuela, listening to you, there's something completely ambiguous or ambivalent about the recent developments. So on the one hand, it sounds like it's Maduro perfecting his takeover of the country, not so much a military takeover of PdVSA as a way for Maduro to utilize, to instrumentalize the army to take over himself with his faction, the oil industry, which is kind of the crowning victory of his takeover of the last couple of years. But at the same time, the cost of this operation is the complete evisceration of any remaining expertise and competency within the company. Mm-hmm. So a suicidal move at the same time. Luisa, is it how you see it, and is it similar to what you see on the debt front?
One of the things about Venezuela and any Venezuelan analyst is that events are taking place. Yes, sure. You could just walk and sit down. Events are happening so fast that is almost at the speed of the depreciation of the Bolivar in the parallel market. So it's very difficult to fit everything into a narrative because they're so fast and they seem connected, but only almost after the fact that you understand what's going on. So I would say that to me, November was a very, very important, October and November have been very important events because there have been 2 paradigm changes that have, I think, for a long time, for the 20 years that we have been following the Chavismo, have taken place. The first one is the idea that, as Francisco has been mentioning, that Chavismo tolerated some kind of technocracy within the oil sector because they understood the importance of the oil sector for the survival of the revolution. The second thing that directed the Chavismo was the idea that you had to pay debt above anything else. And that was something that actually is part of the economic collapse of the country, is that the way the government adjusted to the decline in oil prices and the way the government kept servicing its debt caused a lot of the economic hardship that we're seeing today. In October and November, those 2 things shifted or changed. In the first week of November, President Maduro said, we are paying the PdVSA 2017 capital amortization, and after that, we're not paying anything else. The fact of the matter is that the financial markets didn't know if it was serious or not, if they were really going to default or not. Indeed, they paid the PdVSA 2017, and they said that they will continue to pay. Not very convincingly, but they said that they will continue to service the debt. The fact of the matter is that when you have capital amortizations, you're supposed to pay them at the day that they're coming due, otherwise you're in technical default. So both of these, they had 2 amortizations coming back to back. They were paid not at the date that they were supposed to be paid, which is why both rating agencies, 2 rating agencies, downgraded them to technical default or selective default, and it triggered the CDS, which are credit default swaps contracts. However, because they were paid with a delay, the assumption was, okay, they paid the bulk of the $3.5 billion in debt service payments in October, November. So, what's left are coupon payments. So, and they don't come, one day $1 billion, but 200 million, 300 million. So if you already, service the bulk of your debt, so most likely you will continue to service what is left of those $3.5 billion, which is still a $1.5 billion to pay. But the fact of the matter is that the interest payments, you do have a grace period of 30 days. But as those grace periods ended, the payments are not coming. Actually, maybe Maduro was not joking. There has not been any of the coupon payments after the 2017 amortization payment that have been paid, even though they've said that they are in the process of being paid. So it's very confusing because we don't know if they are they actually already in default or not. I've always thought that the Venezuela debt was going to be in default. I was not very sure about PdVSA because I do think that PdVSA in default is a very complicated proposition. But, and these two events are linked. The Nelson Martinez, Eulogio del Pino, Rafael Ramirez were people that understood the consequences of a default for PdVSA's operations for the oil industry. These people are gone. So one of the most important interest groups about paying debt is no longer there. So we don't know. Quevedo, who's now the new CEO, has said that he will pay debt, but we are not. The fact of the matter is that they have not. So we are not very clear about what's in store. So in both cases, I think, to me, these have been two paradigm shifts. And when that happens, I think you open a Pandora's box. You open the Pandora's box of debt. So we don't know. This is a completely new paradigm. So we don't know where events are going to lead us. My impression is that the sovereign is going to be a moratorium play. Not necessarily. I don't think the government is really thinking about debt restructuring because it's really very difficult to restructure the debt in Venezuela. In relation to PdVSA, we don't know what this means. My impression is that PdVSA already, the PdVSA that we knew it has already disappeared, but I think this is a new paradigm shift in relation to what exactly will be the new plan of PdVSA. We have no clue. Quevedo is saying that he's going to revise all contracts. So what does that mean? And so oil production in Venezuela is already going to decline by 250,000 barrels per day, or between 250 and 300,000 barrels per day this year. This is after already 300,000 barrels per day last year. So in 2 years, Venezuela's oil production has seen a decline of almost 600,000 barrels per day. There's no reason to believe that oil production declines are going to stay where they are. They might accelerate, which means that, let's say that it declines another 300,000 barrels per day next year. It will mean that Venezuela will have put out of the market almost 1 million barrels per day in oil production in the last 3 years, including 2018. So now you understand why Venezuela cannot service its debt, because that's having a significant impact on its cash flow. We look at tanker data, and what we can see is that in October, the declines of oil exports were more than between 300 to 400,000 barrels per day year on year. On an average, looking at January to November, the declines are over 13% in oil exports. So it's not only oil production. The collapse of domestic demand is not compensated for this. You are seeing declines in oil exports. So it is going to have it is having an impact on the cash flow situation, regardless, as Francisco said, of the possibility of the increase in oil prices. So you're heading into 2018 elections in the midst of hyperinflation, with significant constraints on cash flow, with a path of destruction on the oil industry, and with the debt in default, and with no likelihood of restructuring it. So it doesn't look very sustainable from a political perspective, even though we have no visibility how the politics is going to evolve. Let me stop there.
Miguel, what does that all mean for the economy? You've been watching the deterioration of the economy, the debt problems, the inflation, insecurity, humanitarian crisis. What do you have to look for? What can we expect now?
Well, I don't know. First of all, I think Luis already said what I was planning to say, so I'm going to have to think something different now. No, I agree with her that there's an accelerated deterioration of the conditions on the ground. I was looking at some numbers before I came here, and it turns out that the minimum salary in Venezuela has lost in 4 years 92% of its purchasing power. So if you stand on the perspective of 13, well, you can only go 4 more points. Besides the assertions of some colleagues in Venezuela, a thing cannot lose more than 100% of its value. So this deterioration, I'm gonna, just for the sake of saying something different than Luisa, I think we've seen like worse. What's coming, it's terrible, but whatever forces you would expect that will jump in reaction to this strong deterioration, these forces already saw a lot. And what's coming is sort of an asymptote over the x-axis of the situation, accelerated hyperinflation, the government with no capacity to stop that, or even at times willingness to stop that, and a further decline in oil production, etc. I'm just going to divert from the notion that that can lead or will necessarily lead to a change, because not only because we have no theory of change, but because I think that the triggers that should have led to change went off a while ago. And now I just don't see how is that going to happen. I agree that changing in the PdVSA presidency and the changes that have occurred apparently are signaling to a change. But the truth is that even under Eulogio del Pino, in my perspective, they had been preparing for a change for a while. So Venezuela has been diverting oil for a long while out of the US markets. Venezuela, there's something in the cash flow of Venezuela 2017 that it's very hard to understand. If you do the numbers in Excel, you get to the conclusion that they shouldn't have any trouble in paying, because you have the volumes declining, as you said, you have the prices. If something has become easy in Venezuela these days, is doing their dollar cash flow. And then you brought imports down from 16.5 to somewhere in the vicinity of 12, 13. So you, when you do the trade balance, you still get a surplus. You still get that they have done what you would have expected was the worst effort from a political standpoint, bringing imports down from 65 billion when we lost the elections in 12, or 17 billion last year, to 12. Well, they did that. And you should get a surplus there that shouldn't, that should take you, give you the chance to pay them without that much trouble. So what I'm saying is that I think there's something in the way Venezuela is generating its dollars that changed in 17, well before the PdVSA change, that we don't yet understand well. And you have an hypothesis, they are using Rosneft increasingly more, Rosneft make a margin on that so they get less dollars on the net. I'm not that sure, but certainly, I mean, if you do the numbers the way we've always done them, you find no reason why they should be going under such so much trouble. Having said that, I think they will end up paying. I think I still think what I thought when I first heard that they are not paying anymore, which is they're going to default selectively on the sovereign. I think before the day comes that they say we're not paying anything, they're going to stop paying the sovereign, because next year, for the first time, it's the sovereign, the one that has the largest payments. And then, you know, you will sue the republic, you will try to make in the courts the argument of the alter ego of the, yeah, it will take some years, 1 or 2, that for us it's not much, but for them it's like a decade, because they count the days and the months and not the years, and that's how they gotten so far. So all this just to say, I don't think they are going to exit anytime soon. I understand we see a deterioration that we think there's no way this can go on. Yeah, it's been going on for a while, actually. It's been going on for 4 years. The worst of it, it's behind, I think. And yes, you will have more impressive numbers on the inflation front. Now we're moving to 50%, and it's going to be on the thousands. But on the diminishing purchasing power of salary, on the deterioration of health outcomes, it's just an asymptote of what we've been seeing, and I'm not clear that will necessarily create a theory of change that we are lacking at the moment. Having said that, I understand that in Dominicana they have been complaining that they have tried to pay it in every possible way, and because of sanctions, they're having lots of trouble to move the money around, which would explain to some extent the difficulties, assuming they have the money to pay, in moving the money around, and they have tried different structures. And that was their only focus in the whole weekend is, we really need you to get us out of the hook with the sanctions. Not only on the Republic, but also personal, which I'm not sure the opposition has the capacity to help there. And the opposition stated their conditions, with so far, so good. And they walk away, and I guess there are going to be some consultations. But the bottom line is, and I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times earlier on this week, whatever the opposition asks will be granted if it doesn't threatens their hold of power, and if it does, it will not be conceded. And then we're looking here at two outcomes. The opposition walks out of the table again and again, and these negotiations break down, in which case you might have even more sanctions and even more difficulties to turning oil out and then oil into dollars. And yet I don't see how it leads to a change. Or you might have the government making a deal with a certain part of the opposition that is willing to trade some of their votes in the assembly for some parcels of regional power, and then the announcement of a deal that will not satisfy anyone and sanctions will remain in place, in which case I don't think how this can possibly lead to change.
Maybe Luisa and Francisco, you can backtrack a little bit and put this in perspective. I'm not sure everybody is familiar with the recent meetings between the government and the opposition in the Dominican Republic at the end of last week. How did that come about? Who set the agenda? Who participated among the opposition? Where can this lead? Where can we go from here in terms of dialogue?
Well, I mean, this is a return on something that happened, before the opposition sitting with the government to negotiate. Basically, the key sort of landmark is that in the current constitution we have to have presidential elections in 2018, and of course, during all these years of attempts of recall referendum, etc., that date seemed to be sort of something fixed that that eventually will lead to some resolution of the political situation. Of course, when they were able to implement the Constituent Assembly, that opened up the possibility that anything can happen, because the Constituent Assembly basically can say the president stays or the elections are postponed or whatever. But that's sort of the focal point that the international community and the opposition have been trying to work out is to have some fair elections for the presidential elections in 2018. Of course, we had the event recently of the gubernatorial elections that were represented a major defeat for the opposition, and even though there were clear evidence of fraud in one case, in the case of Bolivar, and a lot of irregularities, without a doubt, the opposition voters didn't come out as as expected according to the polls, and government voters seem to, even if you account for irregularities, seem to have come out more than anyone would have expected. So that puts the opposition in a very weak position, and President Maduro feels strengthened not only vis-a-vis the opposition but within his own coalition. It is amazing. We were talking about that a few days ago, that just a year or a little bit more than a year ago, there was a lot of talk inside the Chavismo that President Maduro will have to resign, and there were movements around that happening after the recall referendum didn't happen, etc. And then all of a sudden, it seems that that it's already established that he's going to run for re-election, and there is the presumption that he will be able to conduct the elections in such a way that he will decide who is his opponent, and that he might be able to win, whatever that means. But anyways, on the other hand, we have these economic events that are pretty dramatic. I think I agree with Miguel that what has happened already in terms of the living standards of people, it's so dramatic that it's in percentage terms is not. But hyperinflation politically, we have seen around the world, it's the kind of, it makes people so desperate from their day-to-day living that might generate a slightly different scenario. Even when we talk about Zimbabwe, in Zimbabwe, it led to, even though Mugabe stayed in power, it led to a coalition government because of the degree to which that affects the situation. And of course, the sanctions I think the sanctions had affected more than the government expected, and that even I expected, in the sense that even though they were relatively limited, they have been triggering a lot of difficulties in their business dealings, in their partners in the oil industry, and in particular a country that totally depends on the oil industry. They realize that they are in a death spiral, and of course, and the last point that I wanted to make right now is the issue about Russia and China. As you know, we know that there is a lot of space. Around 600,000 barrels of oil have to be sent to repay these loans to Russia, China, and other creditors. And of course, the Russians and the Chinese have given them a grace period in part of the debt. But that's that equivalent to all the barrels that are generating cash flow at this point are the ones that have to be sent to these two countries. So they hold the key of if Venezuela has some room to maneuver or not, and therefore that creates a situation in which Venezuela has become part of a bigger geopolitical story, in which it's hard to assess which role will China and Russia want to play. We know that the Chinese have been very cautious recently in exposing more of themselves, but also they have become more assertive politically in the world stage. So it's not clear, if they. We know that the Russians, to some extent, were making a play that was, that had some economic component of taking advantage of the situation in Venezuela to take, to accumulate assets at a very affordable prices, to put it. But on the other hand, we have this bigger play with President Putin, the U.S., etc. So I think that's the other variable. And so I think it's hard to know, but the government does seem to be in a position of strength at this point.
So, not that I completely disagree, but let me just try to think about this differently. Since Maduro was elected, the election itself was contested. So Maduro has been in government for the last 4 years, and every year there is a governability crisis. His election itself meant a governability crisis. The following year, in 2014, there were 3 months of protest. He did survive. One thing that I think it's clear is his political survival skills are much more impressive than anyone ever thought. The following year, in 2015, they had an election, and the opposition won handedly the legislative elections. He also managed to quell that challenge to his power. The following year, in 2016, you had the recall referendum. The following year, which is 2017, you have 3 months of protest, the deadliest that we have seen. So what does that tell me? It tells me that Venezuela is in a politically unstable equilibrium. That he manages to win every time doesn't mean that you're not going to have, in 6 months or 9 months, another test to his governability. So the way I see it is that it's true, and when he managed to impose the Constitutional Assembly, I thought the risk of regime change has significantly declined. So what it was clear to me that the trigger for regime change was not going to come from the opposition. And we had seen different moments in these 4 years where there could have been, or where the risk of regime change increased because of movements within the opposition or because of challenges within the opposition. This is different. This is a challenge coming from within. This is a challenge coming from the economic side. And yes, it is true that we have seen already significant hardship, but I would agree with Francisco. Hyperinflation is a completely different ballgame. The other thing, which I think is relevant in this context, is that it's not that we're in a succession war, but countries that are in authoritarian regimes tend to have problems when you are in the middle of a succession or a decision about who is going to be the successor. We had that with MBS in Saudi Arabia. We had that recently with Mugabe. I don't want to compare Venezuela to that. But I do think that Venezuela and the Chavismo has to solve the one issue that they have not solved yet, which is who is going to be the leader of that regime forever, because they want to be in power forever. the regime was not set up, was set up to have one man reelected himself forever, which was Chavez. And Chavez died, and now you have a regime without a leader. And my impression, my reading of all of these events, is that Maduro is playing the political game. He is taking over PdVSA, and he wants to be the guy that will be not the Chavismo. He wants to impose his Madurismo. So my impression is that this is what's going on. This is we're seeing, or some elements of what's going on have to do with that succession war. If he re-elects himself for the next 6 years, that's it. He will take over the Chavismo, and it will no longer be the Chavismo. It will be the Madurismo. So to me, 2018 has a combination of significant economic distress, hyperinflation, oil production declines, oil exports decline, and a political war within the Chavismo that he might win. I'm not saying he doesn't, but it is the combination of all of these things together that lead me to believe there is some chance that actually in the combination of things, this is the next trigger. To me, if he succeeds in this game, I would say that, yes, maybe Venezuela is the next Cuba. But I think we have to see whether he succeeds in surpassing all of these challenges.
Yeah, just probably what I can add to that is the way that I see what's going on in the negotiations that took place and already broke up. It's a negotiation that it's not clear who is calling it, but apparently someone in the international community has demanded the opposition to sit and make a reasonable demand. Reasonable meaning that if you're granted that, you still have a chance to make it to power, and yet you're not supposed to ask the wish list of the Constitution of 1999, which is like the most we want to have. So, and that's the context in which they sat down. The way they sat down, when you have negotiations this big that are sort of winner takes it all, like in 2018, someone will win the election and someone will lose. And the way the country's going, I don't see the ones winning taking too much care of the one losing, nor vice versa, in any case. So in these negotiations of high stakes, the pre-negotiation typically sets some rules. Like David Rockefeller used to say that I don't like to play games where I'm not allowed to put the rules. And Chavismo play by that. So we sat down in the Dominican Republic, which is a super Chavista stronghold of all these 19 years. We sat down with negotiations that are somewhat brokered by José Luis Rodríguez Zapatero, which is someone extremely close to Maduro, and probably someone that is working this on a professional basis, meaning that he gets paid. And then we sit down, and when we sit down, what we see at the other end of the table, it's like the strongest negotiating team of the side of the government. You see the brothers Rodriguez, extremely strong, Roy Chatterton, and then you look at the opposition, and then you see some people. But the opposition guys you would think of, like Leopoldo Lopez, well, Leopoldo cannot sit there. And well, Leopoldo cannot sit. Let's try, Carlos Vecchio. Carlos Vecchio cannot sit there. Well, why don't we try David Smolanki? He's a young guy that has lots of credibility. David Smolanki cannot sit there. Well, why don't we try Freddy Guevara, the vice president of the Venezuelan National Assembly? Freddy Guevara, it's in the Chilean embassy in Caracas. He cannot be there. So what I mean by this sequence of characters that are forbidden, Enrique Capriles, which, I mean, together with Leopoldo, is the leaders of the Venezuelan opposition, cannot sit there. It's politically inhabilitated to sit there. So they choose your team, and you get to play their best team. So the way this is framed, it was framed in a way that when you sit down, I have the feeling personally that you lose before sitting, because they set all the conditions of the game. In spite of that, the opposition towards the middle of last year has finally agreed to request 4 conditions, and they have steadfastly remained constant to those conditions, which is surprising. And those conditions were, again, requested in República Dominicana. So in spite of sitting from an extremely disadvantageous position, because of what I mentioned, but also because Francisco and Luisa mentioned, Maduro just won an election, so he's sitting strong there, however he won it. You're sitting there from a tremendous disadvantage, and yet the opposition played their cards. They wanted to have all the functions of the National Assembly reinstituted. They want to have all the political prisoners free, and they want to have a humanitarian channel, which is a demand of the opposition, that you allow someone in to take care of the situation. And they also demanded that we have free and fair elections under a wide spectrum of international supervision that gives some sense that we can actually have fair elections. So, and the government is demanding one thing. I just want you to help me get rid of sanctions. So it's a very complex negotiation to carry, because you have one card to play which is not even yours. The street, it's cyclical, so it will eventually come back, but at the moment you don't have it. So you have the sanctions, or the power to influence someone who puts the sanctions. That's all you have nothing else. And then they have like the whole constitution, and that's very complex. Second thing, it's what you have, it's a binary thing. Do you approve the budget and the debt, and we issue debt, it's over? But they don't have binary things. They have, how many, ¿cómo se dice rectores?
Council members.
How many council members of the Electoral Council you want? You have one. You want two? 2.5? 2 you, 2 me, and 1 neutral. Whoever that guy is doesn't exist in Venezuela, the neutral guy. So there's a range. So political prisoners, right now I was reading 364. So you want, I can free 50, 100, I can free 100 and then put 50 back in jail, which is what they've been doing. So again, it's a range of things. The functions of the National Assembly. Can I appoint the president of the central bank? Members of the Supreme Court? Can I do that? Well, yeah, 1 member maybe. 2 out of 12? Well, 5, yeah, not the 12. So it's very hard to carry this negotiation. I'm just saying this because people sitting there on the side of the opposition, it's on the tremendous strain, because on top of what I've just told you, they have to go back to Venezuela. And they have to go back to Venezuela, and they know why the ones that are not sitting there are not sitting. They're not sitting because they are in jail. They're not sitting because they have to go into exile. They're not sitting because they had to run into an embassy. So they might be the next. Like Julio Borges can be the next. And he's always under that huge threat. Negotiating like that is not easy. So the opposition, it's negotiating this. I think they did very well. I mean, the best we could have done is, this is the things I demand. First of all, because they are in the Constitution. Second of all, because these things really have the power to produce a political transition. If you don't want to grant me this, then I'm ready to walk out. Walking out is not easy, because both of them will lose. If the opposition walks out, again, all have to go back to Venezuela, be opposition, they will call elections rather soon next year, most likely they will win them, and then you are left as an opposition in Venezuela, prosecuted as ever before, threatened to go to jail, exile. So it's a terrible scenario. For them, it's very difficult. Like Luisa did a very good job when I just sat here describing what they're going through with the sanctions. But I think, and with this, you just want to finish this part, I think this is the type of thing we have been living with Chavismo. It's choose your poison. Both parties are going to lose in this negotiation. So it's just a matter of, I mean, I lose, but I lose less than what you did. And it's what we've been living for 18 years, these choices we're giving. You want A or you want B. You want to go into the elections, they are rigged. You're going to lose them. If you lose them, you're going to let your people down. What are you going to do afterwards? You don't want to go into elections? We will win all of it, and we will occupy every position happily, and you will just relinquish all these spaces. So choose your poison. And this negotiation that it's going on, it's a different variation of the same theme, of we choosing our poison, we being the republic. And I just don't think any good can come out of it, and we will be left to what Luisa was saying, something will have to happen.
Thank you, Miguel. So that's a pretty sobering account. I'd like to invite you to ask any question, there's a microphone standing in the middle of the room. So if you want to ask a question, just walk up to it. There's a few questions that we've received over the internet from people watching remotely, and let me just submit one to the group. One is somebody is asking the panel to comment on the kind of more down-to-earth specific ways in which the sanctions are pinching PdVSA and the economy, and also to comment on the goal of a new cryptocurrency that was aired recently.
Do you want to have him ask the question, and then we can
Yeah,
answer
okay.
both?
Let's do that. Let's take a few questions at a time. So,
Hello, good evening. Okay. My name is Joan Bolanos Martinez. I'm originally from Caracas. I'm a student at the School of General Studies here at Columbia. So one question, I have two questions. The first one is talking about the cryptocurrency. Maduro said Venezuela will have a cryptocurrency. What do you think will be the impact in the oil market? And the second one, in the past, some people called the effect Chavez in the oil market. So can we say now that there is a Maduro effect in the oil market? So thank you so much.
Let me just answer the sanction hitting on PDVSA, maybe comment on Maduro effect on the oil market, and then you can also
Leave to
comment
Francisco the
cryptocurrency.
cryptocurrency,
Yeah, I'm
it's
not
all
gonna
yours.
comment on that. I think Francisco touched upon a very important point, which is that we had no idea what the impact of the sanctions were going to be, because on paper, they didn't look, they looked, yeah, problematic from the sense that you cannot issue new debt, but the impact of those sanctions on the ability of PDVSA to function have been much more significant, not only because of the reputational risk that comes with it, but also because it actually significantly affects the operations of PDVSA in the following way. The sanctions limit also the ability of PDVSA or Venezuela to ask for just regular financing after 1 month or 3 months. You carry on general operations, and you're buying and selling things, and you're contracting things, and you pay in in a month to 3 months horizon. Normally in the oil market, you have 3 months to pay whatever imports or exports you're doing. Because PDVSA and Venezuela have had this long-standing habit of carrying significant arrears on everything. It just so happens that anyone now dealing with PDVSA, where your contracts or your payments are more than 1 month or 3 months due, depending on the specific contract, then you might be actually in violation of the sanctions. So the sanctions are hitting the mere core of how PDVSA works, which is with arrears. So that is why they're one of the reasons why they have been so problematic. And they have accelerated the problems that PDVSA and Venezuela were already having at accessing the international payment system, because of corruption and because of rent-seeking and because of just a regular, because of Venezuela not abiding by the regular standards of general business, you already had a lot of banks that didn't want to deal with Venezuela. So the sanctions have just elevated significantly the risk of any counterparty of dealing with Venezuela, because then you have to check whether are you going to be in violation of sanctions, are you not? So the increased legal fees in order to be sure that you are not in violation of the sanctions almost have raised the cost of doing business with PDVSA and Venezuela. So you're better off not even dealing with them, not even having to deal with them, because you want to avoid even the slight risk of being in violation of the sanctions. So that's why it's so problematic.
So does that affect the buyers of the crude, or also the JV partners who until recently had provided some kind of stability, even growth in some cases in production?
I'm seeing that it has affected the sellers of anything to PDVSA, So, imports of Venezuela, of anything. It has affected all service providers. I am not sure if it's affecting the JVs, but at least those two actors are being really affected by it. And it has affected everyone that buys anything from Venezuela because they cannot get letters of credit. So it's an issue. It's an issue for just the normal operations of PdVSA.
Okay, I mean, in terms of, I think it's even affecting the JVs, and I think the problem is, as you point out, I mean, it's important to understand that, when Chavez came into power, PdVSA by itself produced about 3 million barrels of oil, and, the foreign partners, the remaining production in the country. Today, PdVSA is producing, say, 800,000 barrels at the most. So it's a massive collapse of their own operated production. And what has compensated a little bit or made things less worse than they could be is the fact that the partners, the JVs, have been holding up production. And so if we enter into a situation, and by the way, for example, service providers like Schlumberger or other partners were dramatically curtailing their services to PdVSA, but others, the JVs, they continue, providing services for the most part. So now we can get into a stage in which, if that doesn't even happen, we could enter into a new sort of level of production decline. And what worries me is that some of these partners might, give up because they have been sort of waiting for the situation to, at some point to show some light at the end of the tunnel. But if doing business in Venezuela becomes so hard, and they don't see a resolution, they might give up. On the other hand, the government seems to be, I think, in a naive way, some people in the government thinking that they can substitute all these partners for, say, Rosneft or maybe the Chinese companies, which I think it's not going to happen the way they want. So we could get into a point that it's much worse than it was.
Okay, a couple of words on the cryptocurrency.
Well, I mean, we have to know whatever that means. They have been talking about this for, not about specifically a cryptocurrency, but Chavez 10 years ago talked about the petro and all the time talked about these crazy ideas about having a separate currency that lost value in time, and things that Alfredo Serrano and people like that put into his mind. I don't think there is any way that they will, I don't think they know what is a cryptocurrency. But let's say they create another currency, not a cryptocurrency. Who knows what could be the political, objective of, what I'm sure it's not this a cryptocurrency, but they might create a currency to use in some politically expedient way that we have to figure out. But maybe Miguel has
No, I don't. I'm not even close. I just wanted to make a comment on sanctions, because one thing is the impact of sanctions on the Maduro regime, and a different thing is the impact of sanctions on the Republic. I mean, to make that differentiation, we need to look at the counterfactual. Like, you ask me that now sanctions are lifted and the National Assembly approves the 2018 budget. So what's going to happen? We're going to go and issue debt at 48% in dollars. That's the floor. Because a year ago, when the situation was so much better, we sold bonds to Goldman Sachs at 48% in dollars, 50% after commission. So thus forbidding that operation, it's bad for the Republic. I don't see that. It's actually helping the Republic. It's helping them not to issue more debt at 50% in dollars. Now, for the regime, it's bad. For the handling of the regime, it's bad. When we say they're not given letters of credit, like, when was the last letter of credit given to a Venezuelan company? 2012, 13? Venezuela hasn't seen a letter of credit more than they have seen in an arepa in the street for a while. Like, commercial credit, it's over in Venezuela. You want something delivered to Venezuela, you have to pay in cash in advance. Like, doing business in Venezuela with the sanctions have become very difficult. Like, what do you mean? Like, without the sanctions, what are we talking about? Like, you couldn't even operate in Venezuela. So most of the damage that Venezuela is going through, I just wanted to emphasize that, it's self-inflicted and continues to be self-inflicted. Sanctions are certainly making a dent. They're changing the game. I totally agree with that. But one thing is their capacity to damage the Maduro regime and the way they deal with cash, and a different thing, not necessarily, I'm not saying I'm right, I'm just saying these are two different things. One thing is impacts of sanctions on the regime, and another thing is impacts of sanctions on the Republic, and those are two different things. I'm not sure on the net for the Republic, sanctioning a regime that will issue debt at this rate is a negative thing.
Okay, we have time for a couple of questions. We're running against time constraints, but please, if you can introduce yourself and
Hi, good evening. My name is Antonio Enriquez Garcia, and I'm also from Caracas, Venezuela. I just had a quick question on that note on the topic of sanctions. There's one individual in Venezuela who is very powerful and very influential, but seems to be rather detached from the political scene, but since he's a very wealthy businessman, I'm talking about Lorenzo Mendoza. I was wondering if it would be possible to comment on his influence, the degree to which he can influence the political sphere, the negotiations, his potential role as a political actor in the future, maybe even as for a presidential candidate, but more specifically about how these sanctions have impacted, Empresas Polar, because it's an important discussion to have. Thank you.
So take more, a few more, or
anybody else? Yeah.
Hi, thanks. I just wanted to follow up as well on the Russia-China part of all of this. And I think you mentioned it was 600,000 barrels. I assume that was per day that was going to service these loan for oil deals. I mean, could you help us understand a little bit how important is a renegotiation of some of the terms on those deals, or how likely or how possible is renegotiation, and how much dent would that have in kind of solving the fiscal problems that we're seeing in Venezuela right now? Do we know anything more about kind of the conversations that are happening in Beijing and Moscow as well? Is there any more insight you could give us on whether that's something even the Chinese and Russian governments would be willing to negotiate on?
Can you introduce yourself?
Sorry, Brian Spiegel.
Any third question?
An easy one, because these two.
Hi, my name is Jorge Piedrahita, and I work for Macro Synergy Partners, a hedge fund based in London. I guess part of your comments, or at least implicit, it's the fact that you assume that Maduro will control to be in charge of PSUV, and that he will definitely be the candidate, which seems very likely today. But I'd like each of you to comment on what's the possibility that someone from within Chavismo may decide to replace him. And there are a few things that we can look at. If you look at the discussion on economic matters, you have people like Schemmel or even people like Jesus Faria openly talking about the need for economic reforms. And that's something that, in the past we have not seen, at least to this degree. Then you look at things like, Diosdado Cabello, and then you look at the Redis. Now, the 8 Redis, each of those generals is from the 1987 promotion, which is the promotion of Diosdado Cabello. 5 of those guys have lived in the barracks with Diosdado Cabello. So someone whose star was dimming, a few months ago, now it seems to be coming up. And if you look at his interview, actually, like about 10 days ago or so, he started to sound it like a little bit presidential. And you couple that with comments that we have heard informally, that he has expressed to people privately that the time of Maduro has come. I wonder if he might be someone that, maybe pushing on the other direction. Sorry if it was too long. Thank you.
No, question is if that you're saying can perfectly happen. I have no insight to help you there. I think what it's interesting, it's how will the country look under one of these guys? And to me, that's interesting. Will we have a rate at 10 and another at 115,000? I don't think so. But having a single rate and unifying the exchange rate without restructuring debt, without going to the IMF, without changing the hydrocarbons law so that oil money flows into the country, will only help you to administer the scant, very few dollars you've got in a more efficient way. That won't take you a long way, because the problem Venezuela is having now is a tremendous shortage of foreign currency. So if you, let's say, you free the exchange rate, also these guys believe in the government controlling things. So when they mention economic reform, I will just ask them, what do you mean by that? Freeing the price controls, de facto, that's happening. The price control, it's been lifted de facto, no difference. I mean, the legal apparatus is there, it creates a lot of threat. Unifying the exchange rate, yeah, that will help you to administer better whatever is left after you service debt. So I don't see a country looking much different. Better than this madness, probably, but not much better, not beyond Nicaragua or Bolivia, which are great countries with 2% inflation. Like, no one went wild in Latin America. Like, not even the Chavez partners. Where's the inflation of Nicaragua? Where's the inflation of Bolivia? Like, the only ones that went wild were these guys. Let's say that we bring the EBOs. You know, these guys, some market, I control the media, I expropriate, I want to control things. I just don't see how the country looks that different from that point of view in the event that Maduro goes out and someone, you know, the myth of the practical Chavismo. I've been hearing this like since 2010. No, you know, the Chavismo, they can open the oil business, lots of dollars will come in, they'll unify the exchange rate, and they will stay forever. And it never happened. So I just don't see anyone there that can just give the country a turnaround, a significant turnaround, to turn the country in what most of its citizens would like it to be. But just a meager turnaround out of madness, still pretty miserable. That's my personal opinion.
Not only what you mentioned is that Jose Vicente Rangel saying, you know, with that video, Jose Vicente, I mean, this guy, if he's coming out, that's not insignificant. So Rafael Ramirez, what's going on with him also has to do with this article in Aporrea, you know. So the movements of Maduro seem to me that he is not only trying to control who's going to run in front of him, so he's making sure that nobody else runs within the Chavismo. And that is a fight, which is why I think 2018 could be very interesting politically, because that is a fight that, why would he win that fight? That is not an obvious thing in this context. So I think we don't know yet. This is an open game still. And all of these guys, to me, it's just natural to believe. This is the story of the PRI under Mexico. This is the story of the Chinese. You need to find a way to have a succession within an authoritarian regime. Otherwise, you are bound to have this kind of conflict until you resolve the conflict and one guy like Stalin, you know, won. But to me, you've not yet had that conflict. And to me, what it means, 2018 could be the year where you have that conflict. Again, Maduro might win. Like you guys, you know, you see him much more empowered, much more in control of the situation. He might win. I'm not disputing that, but I don't think it's obvious, even though we don't see it very clearly. I don't think it's obvious because history shows you that this is when regimes have difficulty. On the China-Russia issue, this is very problematic. I mean, the Chinese are restructuring their debt with Venezuela. They have been the ones who did the capital amortization restructuring of Venezuela. So to me, they're behaving already as the Paris Club, as a Paris Club creditor. The Russians too have restructured their debt. So what is happening with bond debt seems like a paripasu on their behalf. They were not going to bail out U.S. bondholders because they themselves are in the middle of debt restructuring. So, going back to the cash flow situation, the tanker data is telling you that all exports right now, Venezuela, are 1.4 million barrels per day, around. That's what the October-November averages are. Again, tanker data is not, it's not perfect, but it's the best proxy we have. If Venezuela is already sending 600,000 barrels per day, in oil shipments because of debt service, this is a country that is living out of 800,000 barrels per day. You cannot sustain a country with 800,000 barrels per day and pay bond debt. So it's just that the cash flow it just doesn't add up. So to me, I look at the same numbers that you're looking at, and I just see that you are heading for, I think there is a debt problem. I am not sure if Venezuela, if they will continue to pay the sovereign, if they will continue to pay PdVSA. It does seem to me that at least for a little bit longer, but I don't see that they're going to pay the sovereign debt. Why would they? Exactly for the same reasons that you have mentioned. Whether the Chinese and the Russians will sustain Maduro, to me, they're behaving as a distressed creditor, in the sense that why not get things for cheap and for very cheap? And they have a very important, they have an advantageous situation. But can they really sustain the Maduro administration? I don't know. I think that remains an open question.
So lots of open questions. I think we're running out of time, so I suggest, Francisco, maybe we start with you with the oil outlook. Maybe we close with you again, and you bring it back to the outlook for oil.
Okay. So, I mean, following on what Luisa said, I think both Russia and China had been, Venezuela had been defaulting on both of them de facto. And they both decided to sort of normalize the situation. In the case of the Russians, they only accepted to give a sort of a very advantageous renegotiation, but on the part that was to the Russian government for the military equipment, not on the Rosneft debt, which is the one that I think is the most relevant one. And moreover, this was already, as I said, in default, so it's not improving dramatically the conditions. On the Chinese side, they have done it in the past. I don't have clarity about what exactly, because for example, what triggers Venezuela to pay back. It was a 2-year thing, but also they say that there was a price trigger, etc. So, in terms of the future of the oil sector, I think what Luisa said it seems the most likely scenario, a decline that it's at least the same magnitude in barrels, which of course, because of the base is lower, means a higher percentage decline. And because you have still the domestic market, that has shrunk dramatically, but still, gasoline is free in Venezuela and there is smuggling, so, it's still going to be 400,000 barrels or more, the whole domestic market. Then, that leaves you with a sort of a smaller and smaller space in terms of cash flow generating barrels, and that is, to me, the death spiral that they are not going to be able to avoid. If I am the Russians and the Chinese, and I'm looking at what's happening now, I'm like, is this guy Quevedo going to allow us to get repaid? No, this is very bad news for them too. So I wonder how they are looking at this. They may say, well, let's wait until there is a political resolution in 2018, and then we deal with this. But this is unsustainable in any. One final thing that, in terms of the politics, that I wanted to mention is, hyperinflation has this very specific dynamic, which is that the one who stops hyperinflation, we have had this history of hyperinflation in many countries, and the one who stops hyperinflation usually is tremendously popular, has a boost in popularity. I tend to agree with Miguel that they don't seem to have the capacity of doing what it takes. But the recipe to stop hyperinflation is by now pretty standard in the world. So if someone came, and did a turnaround, that could buy tremendous political capital and will. The government today faces, and I do agree with Luisa that this is a very complex year, because not only you have all these economic events happening and hyperinflation exploding, but you have the very fact that the president has about 20% approval rating. So winning an election when you have 20% approval rating is not easy. Even if you cheat all the way through it. So that creates very clear risk. And on the other hand, a guy like Cabello might think, if I don't do anything before 2019, I'm done.
I'm done.
Yes.
I might be, out of the picture. So it is a very risky year for Maduro, without a doubt.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. It's an incredibly complex situation, complex question. Our panel, I think, has brought tremendous insights and a lot of granularity in the comments, but also capacity to provide a vision and organize all these complex facts into a kind of somewhat orderly narrative. So a big hand to our speakers, and thank you very much for coming tonight.